we haven't seen each other in 40 years. We all went to RISD together. We were all friends of Francesca's and had different relationships with her. And we've never gotten together to really talk about it, and then we met. So you guys are in the room, and Peter's in the room, and Sloan's in the room, and I'm here, and I feel like Francesca's here too, which is really special, and she has to be in the room too, because everything that we've been doing and thinking about and trying to honor is our respect for her and our love for her and our friendship with her and how we all functioned at RISD. This box that is what the collection upstairs is drawn from was, I kept all of the evidence and artifacts from our relationship in this box. I kept it for other friends too, but in Francesca's case, I had a lot of material and a lot of awesome material because she was creating these amazing photographs. She was the first real artist I had ever met, and it was just a beautiful collection of letters and ephemera and pictures that I took of her and she took of me and we took of each other and prints that I gathered off the floor. And I kept this box tight after we graduated from RISD. And then when she died, I kept it even tighter because it made me sad to look at this work and put it out in the world and even think about how I was going to put it out in the world and share it. And it took a long time of living with that work to quietly put away to even think about sharing it. And even this process with Nora of bringing it out the last 2 years and looking at it and everyone being so excited, even up until the opening for me was extremely hard because it was not so much the work as the story of our friendship and the story of being at RISD and the story of being this extraordinary person in our life. And when you look at your friends from your life, you get all kinds of things from different friends. And I think every relationship every day is special. But then there's certain people that are just like like an astonishingly bright light. And I don't think any of us had ever met someone like Francesca, and I don't think any of us had ever since she died, she's stuck with us. And what we're going to try and focus on today, the show stays very clearly with the time that she was at RISD, and I was clear with Nora and I were very clear with each other that we were only going to talk about what I knew and what I experienced. And while many people didn't know Francesca and have written about her in interesting ways and curated her work in interesting ways, and we wouldn't even be here if her parents and Marian Goodman and everyone that's embraced her hadn't done such a good job. Today, and what this chapter's about and what this exhibit's about is an experience that I had with her and my friends had with her, and we're gonna kind of try and stick to how the work was created and our experiences at RISD.
Okay.
Understood.
I was hoping we'd have more fun, and I hope that we will.
We will.
And one of the things that's crazy is Francesca was a lot of fun, and that kind of got lost in the whole narrative of the way that she's gone out in the world. And we're going to talk a little bit about that too. So I was thinking that it would be fun to talk. Peter remembers the first day that we had class together.
Yep, I do.
And let's hear about that.
It was a Wendy McNeil class, and I don't know, there were a dozen of us, and it was the first day of our sort of presentation of ourselves as photographers. RISD was structured in a way that your first year was a boot camp, and no one was allowed to declare a major. It was sophomore year where you were allowed to define yourself as a photographer. And this was our first class, and I remember we had all produced work already, and there were a lot of rocks and icicles and prints that were carefully made. That was a focus, was how do you make a beautiful print? And so the work was rather academic, and we had work on the wall that represented that pursuit. And then Francesca put 6 nude self-portraits of herself on the wall and kind of defined herself as being on a different plane altogether. At that point, we all realized that we were in the presence of somebody that was working at a different level than any of her fellow students at that moment.
So one of the things that I think about is we were all at RISD trying to be artists, and Francesca was actually pretty fully formed once she started.
Right.
And that was because of the way she was brought up, and also kind of this incredible talent.
And also courageous in a way that no one else was. I mean, just the fact that she was naked in those pictures, and here we all are, we're, I don't know, a couple of years out of adolescence, if we were lucky. And here was this person defining themselves this way as an artist on the wall, naked.
Right.
It was just mind-blowing, honestly.
Right. So Sloan, you were naked with Francesca in some of the pictures.
Well, not the day I met her.
Okay, tell me about the day you met her.
I met Francesca. First of all, I want to say that you're looking at 3 people that loved Francesca Woodman. We knew her each a little bit differently, but there aren't a whole lot of people ever in the same room that truly loved Francesca Woodman. She was so difficult. Most people got to know her a little bit, said, a little narcissistic for me, and walked off the pattern. Right. George did not, nor did Peter, and nor did I. So I'll tell you a little bit about meeting her the first day of school. She came to the room and asked, it's very different from the first class, we're in the dorm. She asked to borrow my scissors. And I thought, well, I need to know who I'm giving them to. So I say, what's your name? She says, Francesca. And I remember thinking, well, there's a rude way to say it. So she then cordially says, what's your name? And I went, Sloan, like with this long O. She echoed it and went, Sloan. So the 2 of us didn't like each other at all at first. Wow. But then we went into Betsy Burns' room, and Betsy had a whole shelf of stuffed animals, and we invited her to join us. The scissors came back, said, you want to go to lunch? First day of school. Betsy's naming the stuffed animals. That was a moment, a defining moment in our friendship. We look at each other and go, so now we're bonded because we're not going to name the stuffed animals.
Right. And then what happened?
Then we have a lifetime of
Sloan
6 years of very close friendship. I was with her making pictures and enjoying her as my closest friend I think I've ever had. Wow. Ever. I still miss her every day. I think of things that remind me of her almost every day.
Yeah. It's funny when you have these relationships that are very contained in your life, and for a relatively small part of your life. I mean, Francesca, and we were friends with her for a 10th of our life, and she's made a really powerful impression. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is not to imagine what it would be like, as years progressed after she was gone, but like trying to understand what was happening. So I think it would be interesting if you could talk about the process of maybe, if you remember, making one of the pictures. I mean, one of my favorite pictures upstairs is the one with the mass. And do you remember anything about
I remember a great deal about that. But there's one that I was telling my friend David Spira, who's here today, about that I want to use as the example of how she thought about her work and how she created it. In this case, it's early on in meeting her, and she said, I want to outline your body in neon. I had not taken off my clothes entirely yet, posing for her, but I asked her how to do it, and she said, you can help me. We got to go buy Jell-O. So she made me walk to Star Market, like 14-block walk. We came back with about 14 boxes of Jell-O. I didn't know what she was going to do with them. Next few days later, when we had free time together, because we're in classes, she says, you want to come to Brown University, we call it refectory, or ISD, cafeteria at Brown. And we go in, and she had made friends with a very cute dishwashing guy. She made him give her all the trays, the thick industrial-sized trays. So we take them back to Pilgrim Mill. She's in Pilgrim Mill's studio in the room you have recreated here upstairs. And she then, within a week, we got to go buy a refrigerator. Now, I don't know how any of this is going to lead to outlining my body in neon, but the refrigerator is delivered to Pilgrim Mills. And we don't have pictures of the refrigerator. These things moved in and out. Things like mattresses. Well, it all moved in and out, depending on what she was doing. It was truly her photographing space. So she gets me, finally, the first time, to take off all my clothes in a very cold, drafty studio. And she's got sheets of Jell-O in the refrigerator, and she cuts them into strips, little thick strips and long strips. And she has me lie down with a light behind me in the window you see reproduced. And she photographs me with the light coming through the Jell-O on my body, on my legs, on my outline. I'm lying down. Now, I'm dying to see how these pictures are going to come out, so I go to Benson Hall, where the studio,
that was the photo
photo department hall on the campus. And she says, yeah, you can come in with me. So I go in and I watch for the first time the picture of my body outlined in neon coming right up. And you know what I say? I'm thrilled. I am beside myself. This is the most incredible picture. I mean, not only is it of me, but it was the idea come to life before my eyes. And what does she say? She says, it's horrible. It's a reject.
Interesting.
So I always use that as my example of a way she works. This is one way. There are many ways.
So what do you remember of the picture?
Oh, the picture with the mask. Okay, again, it's in Pilgrim Mills outside the room you've recreated at the top of the stair to the right. And it's cold. We don't want to take our clothes off. And Susan Eslick was supposed to come to that show. If you noticed in the picture, we're nude, but there's another face of Francesca's face. The masks are actually photographs of Francesca's face. And there's an extra one pinned to the wall because Susan Eslick didn't show up. But Liza von Rosenstiel and I did, and Francesca I was really annoyed. I said, what are you doing? You're keeping your shoes on. You're still warm. We've got to I was really, so it was a friendly thing. It didn't take long. She just said, stand here and hold it was a very immediate thing. But in her journals, which I had a key, it's hard. I have so much to say about a friendship. I am writing a book about it, so there's a lot more detail. But she gave me a key to wherever she lived. She got Pilgrim Mills, convinced her parents within the first month of school to rent an additional space. I couldn't believe it. My parents were going to spend another $100 a month at the time to give me space. I said, how do you get your parents to do that? She goes, well, we believe in space for artists. So, now we're coming from another background from my parents.
There was no living part of that space. Peter, why don't you talk a little bit about the actual space and how it worked and your experience in there? Part of it.
Part of it.
Well, whatever part you want.
It was interesting. I had a very different reaction to that photograph upstairs with the multiple naked women all wearing Francesca's face, because we had a different borderline romantic relationship, and in that period of time. In an art school, there was sort of like this interchangeability of partners, if you can imagine.
De rigueur of the 70s, I always say.
And I thought that photograph, when I saw it, was sort of very specifically pointed. I had a different reaction to it, suffice to say. And in the interchangeability of that, in the little social structure, Francesca had this interesting pattern where she would, anytime I was engaged in any way with one of our fellow students, that became sort of someone she wanted to photograph. And so I was always a little bit trepidatious, and I was always a little suspicious of some of Francesca's murky motives.
That's a funny idea that she would be, we think of the models in the pictures being, whether they're self-portraits or whether they are models for an idea that she had, and she was certainly using people that were available, her best friends and things like that, but that she was using it as a statement to, another person she was involved with, puts a whole other spin on.
Well, there was a self-portrait in a way, and it was a way of using her photography, very specifically to address her social life also. And there was a discussion earlier about using prints in the mail, or how those objects were used. I have actually quite a few photographs that were taken very specifically for me, where there are my initials, or there's a birthday card, and there's candles at the end of her fingers, where it was not an afterthought to make a piece of mail out of a reject print, but in fact, the photograph was made with a very specific intention. And sometimes it was sweet and endearing, and other times it felt slightly weaponized.
Do you remember taking me to the post office because they wanted that I was going to be arrested you had a car. So I'm living with George sophomore year, and he had a car. That was big. And
Sloan and I were roommates for.
Right, and Francesca introduced us. I came back, summer I was working, and I didn't have time to procure an apartment. And Francesca said, I'm going back early, I'll find you a place to live.
George.
Well, she just brought me to meet you. Here it is, and I was going to live with George, and that was it, and it worked out just great.
Yeah.
But at one point, she sent me a picture, always with some nude on it, folded, as you've described. It was also a very normal thing, a recycled way to go about mail. And the Postmaster General of Charleston, South Carolina, didn't like nudity in the U.S. mail system, so he sent to the Automated Post Office of Providence registered summons for me to appear. And you and Francesca and I talked about me appearing, and we all agreed, I don't remember whose idea was it, but I'd dress like a hooker. So you had the car, and you don't remember this,
No.
and you drove us to the post office, and I had Francesca's high-heeled gray boots. They're in some pictures, and they're folded down. And I clicked down a very long hallway with a man at every door leering out at me, in the shortest skirt I owned, and then it was very difficult to talk to this guy saying, well, the Postmaster General isn't very happy with you. Is this your letter? And I said, well, why do you ask? And he said, well, because you'll be sent to jail or heavily fined if you ever do this again.
Oh, wow.
So I said, well, I'm in art school, and I can write any way. He goes, can I do a handwriting analysis? I said, I can write any way you want. So
That's funny.
I did an analysis in 7 different scrawls with every letter. And
Do you remember?
I never got arrested.
Do you remember the pictures she did with Charlie the model?
Oh, yeah, I was there.
Okay,
I took
Charlie the
a lot of
model,
those.
when you went to drawing class, he was the guy, and he was a very
you have to
odd, slightly scary. You felt a little sorry for him. He was not the kind of person that you would take back to your loft and take pictures of naked.
Right. He had a great, huge belly, and he was a good way to warm your arm up.
He had a weird posture.
In drawing class. And he did seem to have some sort of psychological defect,
That's generous, Peter.
which made it that much more alarming that Francesca would choose Charlie to be alone with naked.
Right.
As her friend, I can say I worried about the whole idea.
Yeah.
As I remember, those pictures were taken in the nature lab, and there was a glass case involved.
Maybe on another occasion.
Specimen case which is something that's alluded to a lot in other pictures.
That
where
was in the basement of.
it was sort of Charlie as a specimen, Charlie as a model, herself as a specimen, and I think that there's a lot of instances where Francesca actually would separate herself and her own nakedness from certainly any sexual suggestion at all, but more as sort of almost a botanical object, or as a specimen of human nakedness. And that's what Charlie was, but at the moment, I was mortified that she was going to be naked with Charlie. I
Right.
thought she's going to need a bodyguard, or something could happen that was untoward.
Well, she asked me to be there because she was worried about that exactly. But
Understood.
Charlie, I was there in the series, the Charlie series pictures. I shot a lot of them, and I was there in order to be helpful if something went wrong.
Oh, that's interesting.
But we both agreed, tentatively, that he was a professional model, which he was. He did very unusual poses for hours, and he was proud of that. Charlie Mocho is his name. When he saw you, he'd say, "Hi, friend."
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And it was to everyone. He was like famous on campus. There are thousands of. He was our model for years and years. I don't know how many years he was there, 30 or 40.
So I want to discuss a little bit about how Francesca was perceived at school, what you remember. Not only us, but everyone else. Like, do you remember how the teachers responded to her work? Do you remember how students felt about her work? Was there jealousy? Was there anger?
Well, I could say that, you know, again, part of what we were all doing at that time was, in fact, you know, speaking to the sort of the Ansel Adams-ness of what it was to be a photographer in the 70s. Ansel Adams had managed to perfect process, is his whole zone system, the way he exposed his film, the way he processed his film, the way he made those prints were extraordinary and actually made them worthy of being, you know, objects that were collectible, and something that you guys spoke to earlier. That was an objective of ours, or it was an objective of mine, was to make, you know, extremely high quality prints. And the subject matter, you know, was important, but it was secondary, or, you know, it would be great if the subject matter was as good as the print, but it didn't really matter if you were taking pictures of twisted metal, like, you know, an Aaron Siskind-esque kind of observation about the world. But Francesca's work, I think, was largely seen as being not well printed, you know, like a substandard printing.
So do you think that she was judged harshly because of the quality of her craft, like her craftsmanship, or people could not see to the quality of the image?
I think that the quality of the content was clearly supreme over the quality of the technique.
Right, but so do you think she was judged?
I think some of the boys thought, oh, yeah, those are shitty prints. You know, wow, yeah, she, you know, it's like.
I'm going to get to Doug in 1 second, but I just want to go with this for a second, because one thing that's happened since, as Francesca's legacy has built so much, is that it speaks so strongly to women, and especially to women artists.
Right.
And I actually don't want to go too far into this because this is your world, but I'm just curious, at RISD, do you think that there was a gender appreciation of, like, do you think that women related to her work more than men, or women were horrified by it, or whatever?
Well, I could say that there's no man that could have taken those pictures.
Right.
Period.
But were there, like, what was even the gender breakdown in the class? Was it 50-50 in our classes? And were people talking about gender issues at all in class?
I can't say that I really remember that specific conversation. And I would say that also it were mostly boys.
And I just want to give one anecdote about Wendy McNeil, which is I went to Wellesley to visit a friend one night. I wound up sleeping in an all-girls dorm in the study hall. And it was filled, this is before I started RISD, it was filled with pictures by Wendy Snyder McNeil, and I could not get enough with these pictures. I stayed up all night, I loved these pictures. And then I went to RISD, and I got involved in the faculty search committee with Aaron Siskin and Harry Callahan, both very famous, I'd say traditional photographers out of Chicago who were running the department at RISD. And there was another photographer, I think it was Bert Beaver,
yeah.
who was on this committee. And I knew nothing about Wendy except she was a teacher and that she had taken these pictures that I loved. And I suggested her at this meeting in the spring, and they said, oh, we would never hire a woman. It was all male faculty. And I came back in the fall, and they had hired her. It was so, I don't know how those issues played out at all, but I don't remember it being discussed. But anyhow, Sloan has an interesting story about Doug Prince.
Doug Prince. Let's see, Bert Beaver, you mentioned just now, is a Canadian. He was the head of photo department. And what I brought today to read to you I thought was interesting, the faculty evaluations, since we've talked a little bit about how she was perceived at the time, and we're keeping into that era. So her department head, Bert Beaver, and photo 3. Well, maybe I should go to photo 2 first. Photo 2, but photo 3, I'll do with Bert. Bert says, excellent work. Your ability to express your very personal feelings in your work is wonderful. I hope you continue to do so. And then we have Doug Prince. Doug Prince became a friend of Francesca's. He was a grad school teacher primarily. He did a few undergraduate classes. I spoke to him before I came here, and he didn't quite remember that she was in those undergrad classes. But he did remember that he used her all the years running that he was in Providence teaching, 3 or 4, that he used her for the subject of his environmental portraits, which is his idea to show, and it relates to this show, to show artists in their environment. And your pictures document that as well. So you and Doug Prince went to the trouble to say, let's look at the other side.
Right, but it was always weird when your teacher photographed you. Wendy photographed me once, and I was so looking forward to it, and it was one of the most disappointing moments of my time at RISD.
Right, and these pictures Doug took, he has a whole series year after year, and they're very strange. You can see that Francesca's a little bit uncomfortable. Yeah. Anyway, he writes and gives her an A. These are all A's. Your background and commitment in art have made you an atypical and interesting student in photo 2. Your concepts were far beyond the level of the class, but your use of the medium hasn't caught up yet. I think that reflects on her poor method of printing. She was a messy girl.
One other thing, photo 2 was sophomore year.
I'm not telling you that. This is December 1976. So your concepts were far beyond the level of the class, but your use of the medium hasn't caught up yet. I think your biggest challenge will be to combine a use of discipline and freedom to maximize your ideas and to maintain expectations of yourself without getting too self-critical or afraid to make mistakes. The work has a spirit, and you should allow it to grow as much as it can. And a quote, I have copies of her journals that Betty Woodman, her mother, the ceramicist, gave me some years ago to work from. And in a quote in her journal, she writes about Doug Prince, something he said. One thing about Francesca, she loved turn of phrase. And in her father's letter, you may see that too if you read the one upstairs. So she puts down Doug's turn of phrase, days are laminated planes of light. Isn't that beautiful? So that would be something she appreciated within a faculty member. And then I have another one here. This is, my husband became Francesca's teacher as well, a little bit later, a year after we were all together. So this is Hardukek's evaluation, again an A after a year in Rome following the freshman and sophomore years we're primarily talking about here. But it's nice to hear what a faculty says. Francesca's drawings and photographs both demonstrate ability, but what characterized them specifically is a point of view which grows more and more consistent and insistent, as do also her critical judgments with respect to them. Her work is always fresh and original, technically competent, because we're a little later in the story, and reflects a broad range of resources she has brought to it from Rome and elsewhere in Italy, an excellent and responsible member of the European Honors Program. And that's fun for me to read because Francesca introduced me to my husband freshman year.
Wow.
So before I met you, I had met him.
Wow.
I don't remember her printing in Benson Hall ever.
She did.
Not a lot.
Well-
She set up her own darkroom, and she had her own darkroom in her bathroom. And I remember specifically her telling me I need to clean up my darkroom for bathing in.
Right.
And that, it was,
But the bathroom was dark. That I
right.
remember. I was
But I
always
remember
frightened in that bathroom.
Right, and I remember that being sort of illustrative of also the level of, commitment that she had to making art that was just on a different level
It
than
was on
any
a
of our
different
sort of suburban, dabbling, student-y kind of, we lived in a dorm and there was like laundry facilities and we went to the refectory and she had her own loft space that's depicted upstairs. There was a hot plate and
And a violin case.
and a violin case. And she just inhabited a space as an artist so completely that, again, she lived it she walked the walk in a way that was, and it was also, there was always risk involved. I mean, she liked to live in bad neighborhoods. It was dangerous for her, I thought, dangerous for her to live in that place, just as it was when she moved to the Bowery in New York. But those crusty spaces were part of what defined her. Those chipping
It
walls.
was the texture of all the pictures.
Right.
But what was interesting to me is most of us at RISD had a workspace. I had a workspace across the street from Francesca's, but I also had an apartment with a bathtub that wasn't doubling as a darkroom, with a
Right.
kitchen, and
We shared the studio off through Bowerly. Remember our tower studio at the bottom of Meeting Street?
right,
Yeah.
right. So so that was so the idea that Francesca lived in her workspace and created a space that was so much the canvas of all her pictures. And I remember specifically going to that space and taking pictures and thinking, this is kind of wild, taking pictures on Francesca's canvas. It's almost like I was painting on something that she had created, and I was thrilled to be there. And I just think, at least in my experience, I appreciated so much, even at the time, not knowing how the work would go around the world or anything else, but just my own experience. Like, this was something really special that someone had such a clear vision and was so obsessed with creating work that was, it was so inventive and powerful and emotive and touched me so deeply. And yet, as a friend, she was so needy, I felt. And that she was so zoomed in on what she did every day that, like, the idea of having a real kitchen or the idea of friendships that go like this or to be able to step back and look at the big picture rather than just her small piece of it was extremely hard. And I felt like the piece that I could help her with was, I mean, it's mostly through Sloan, but she would come up to our apartment and go in the shower, and steam would be coming out of the door till the hot water ran out. And then Francesca would emerge with her hair in a towel, and she was hungry, and we would feed her. And but it was that friendship that was supporting, hopefully, or allowing her to do what she did. That was, and I feel like looking back at that now, I try and do that in my friendships now, but most people can kind of balance, especially when they get a little bit older, can balance the being able to do work, although I would argue that most of the people we know could not go that deep, as Francesca was almost brought up to do. And I think that that the responsibility of people that can function in the world and that can earn a living and that can take care of themselves, to take care of the people that are, Francesca was fragile, and we knew that, I think. Would you agree?
Right.
Yes, she was fragile, but she had a confidence that was greater than our own at the same time.
Around the work.
Around the work, but around talking to men. She was way ahead of sexual proclivity, management, and power she came a year younger than the rest of us. She came at, 16 to RISD, and we were at 17. Is that right? No, how old are you when you go to college? Anyway, she was a year younger than we were. And she came in knowing how to walk right up to a man and take over. And I remember then, she gave me the key she gave me her dorm room when she moved to Pilgrim Mills in that first year, her single room. But she had to be seen, it's against all rules, she had to be seen in the dorm room showering so they wouldn't suspect she was missing. So she came in every morning to shower, nearly every morning, and she'd have a croissant for me. She'd woken up very early. It was her pattern to get up very early and start thinking about art. And she'd come with it, and she'd wake me up and tell me who she'd slept with that night. So I had this ongoing thing. I'd say, that's wrong, and then I'd say, tell me more. So it got to be this thing where I couldn't believe on one side her confidence that way.
Right.
But then if I was going to New York, she'd say, can I come too? And I'd say, well, not unless you wash your hair and put some clothes on. There was the needy part that then you'd have to coax her into doing things that we would take for granted.
So tell me,
as normal, I suppose.
Briefly, although we all want to hear about the sex, tell me briefly about the part that she was thinking about art.
Well, that's the most interesting thing for me. In the friendship and the turns of phrase and the way she thought about things, the way she thought about everything, the way she thought about making a picture was primary in her days. That's what you do. You wake up and you think about it. So she has a journal, and she tells me to keep one, but she keeps one for herself. Then we have this thing where we write back and forth in each other's journals. So I am privy to all the ideas as they unfolded.
Was she drawing
so
in the journal?
Let's take a picture in the show. We have Women Under Pressure.
Yeah.
And you have
the woman
if you all
holding
saw the
a
show,
piece of glass against
big piece of glass pressed off a large bosom of Paula Anderson. Paula had back trouble because her breasts were so large. She had to have reduction surgery. So she comes to Francesca and says, will you take my before and after pictures? She wants to be documented. So that picture is credited to be a woman's lib. Now we have 70s and we've got the movement there. We haven't talked a lot about that, but I wouldn't say she's a woman's libber, but she used that as a format. And then I think she became famous in the photo department. Everybody in the school saw that picture and went, whoa.
Yeah.
It's a very important picture.
I remember a couple of instances. Well, when I photographed Francesca, which I did on a number of occasions, she was such an expert at knowing how she was going to be seen by a camera in her own pursuit, that when one photographed her, it kind of became a Francesca picture, that you could not escape the vortex of the Francesca-ness, and part of that is because, again, I think that she used her body as a sculpture that she would place in various environments. And toward the end of some of her last photographs were very sort of specifically relating to sort of the human figure in architecture, and how almost how she would sort of project her own body into art history. And so when you photographed her, particularly if she was naked, those pictures automatically kind of took on that sort of sculptural form, and she completely knew how it was going to be. And to this day, I have, those photographs are among my best work, I think.
Right.
They're
So I want to end our section on advocacy, which is I'm going to ask all of you to follow Peter, and when he posts, which he did this morning, his photographs of Francesca, make lots of comments and likes so he'll post more of them because they are extraordinary. They're all sitting on his phone, and it was all that I could do last night when I had his phone in my hand, not to send them all to myself. Every
They are
single one,
beautiful.
they're really beautiful. So
beautiful.
follow
That's so sweet of you.
Peter.
Thank you.
Send notes to Sloan to tell her to finish her book on Francesca that she's been working on in her head for 40 years, but is now close to actually seeing the world. And my piece of it is sharing the work that's upstairs. And also, just huge thanks to Nora and the staff at MCA for babying me through this.
Yeah,
And in my insecurity and in my fear, they were there and they understood what we were, what the work was about. And it's really, the show is really about how Francesca lived. So thank you.
Thank you, George. It's very sweet of you. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, so we talked a lot about her work where she's in the nude, but there's also a number of pictures up there, and also ones I've seen very long dresses, very heavy visual mask to the photo. Can you tell me about the contrast between those and the nude work that we talked a lot about tonight?
Who are you speaking?
Was that directed to anyone in particular?
No one in particular. Anyone has a thought on
I could actually make a comment. You know, one of the challenges that we all had that was spoken to by the previous panelists were this idea that you know, in the 70s, you know, there was a limited market for photography as art, and I know that as a student, I didn't want to perish in New York, penniless or with a hot plate in, you know. And one of the things that you could hope for was to do fashion photography. I mean, you know, I didn't look at John Zarkowski necessarily as being the ultimate curator. I looked at Alexander Lieberman as being the ultimate curator, because he was working with Avedon and Penn and Deborah Turbeville, who Francesca admired greatly. And I know that we all sort of were skirting on the edge of, well, maybe fashion photography. Maybe that would be a way for us to kind of go sideways into the art world. And so whenever there were clothes involved, I think that there might have been sort of like, well, maybe this is a fashion picture. I'll call this a fashion picture. Might be one answer.
I think I would just say that she, you know, to pick up what Drew and Jessica alluded to earlier, she was drawing kind of ideas from a lot of different sources, and I think surrealist literature and art was a key source for her that was very generative, and I think a lot of her work with textiles and fabrics and clothing kind of speaks to I would say a fascination, a curiosity about that era, and a lot of artists of that era. And I do think that, you know, part of what we've tried to pull out is that a lot of her works are themselves kind of composed, and even if she's figuring herself, there's still a lot of staging and props and kind of, you know, a performance of sorts that's really at play. So nude or clothed, it's still highly performative, I would say.
When I asked her why she was wearing the
Another
clothes,
real
these layered clothes of silk and mohair and angora and fur, she'd say, well, I can't afford the really good stuff new. And my mother always dressed me in Kmart.
Wow.
So she would go for the fabric and the pattern, and then those patterns are used if you see the other work. Not so much George's box of pictures, but her other body of work that's been published. You'll see that the pattern is movement in the dresses, and that they're all used very carefully in the darkroom as well, dodging. She took a fur and she would dodge it, and she would make it as a whole. If you look at these pictures, you'll see that the clothes are used as an integral part of the idea.
Absolutely. Wait, there was one question, and I'm sorry to steal a question from the audience, but one question I've had for you guys that I've been wanting to ask is, to what extent were you, we've talked a lot about an awareness of what was happening in kind of avant-garde and contemporary art practice at the time, but what about popular culture? Like, what kind of, engagement with, movies and, books and literature, but magazines, like not high-minded necessarily, like, what most teenagers are kind of curious about. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Like fashion pictures, like fashion magazines. I mean, I know that
Love fashion.
there was, sort of a Vogue-y, there was actually good work being done for Vogue. People were doing good work for Alexander Lieberman, who was the Uber chief of all of Condé Nast. And I think, that was an obvious resource and an obvious objective. One could make a living and make art by mistake or make art sideways.
Sloan, do you even remember the music that you was listening to?
It was the radio. She didn't care much about music.
That's interesting.
She didn't drink. We didn't go to the clubs. I went, but I never went with Francesca. Yeah. To the Met Cafe and all that.
Right.
All the Talking Heads and the Foggy Vision Boys and all the stuff
Right.
that was popular.
Yes, question here. Let me just repeat the question so everyone could hear. The question was, having watched the documentary, The WOODMAN'S, in which Sloan is featured prominently, to ask about the end of Francesca's life. And the question was, why did she give up at the end, or was it when it felt like it was just the beginning? Is that a correct?
Was it in her mind not the beginning? Did she think she should have been in a different place?
I can't speak for exactly what she may have thought or why she would have committed suicide, but I know from the letters after the first attempt that she wanted to leave something behind that we would all remember. So I'm really glad the whole world is joining her in that. It's a very personal answer, based on letters and things. But she did a lot of fashion photography. She worked for a fashion photographer. She loved Deborah Tuberville. And fashion was really, Peter's absolutely right, it's really important to her. But things didn't happen fast enough for her. She was ahead when she came the first day of school. School didn't have, the classes, assignments, nothing happened fast enough for her. She was going through being an artist and was sort of, as you say, we felt like she was fully formed. My husband never agreed. He said, no, she's immature, she's young, come on.
Well, that's,
I would argue with him.
that part's
our
interesting
entire
because I
marriage.
think most of the teachers felt that too. That all this fuss, especially
Yeah.
after she was gone, was really overrated.
To
So-
some, I agree.
And she graduated early too. So
She
she
did.
started young and she graduated early.
She did. And it was easy for her.
Well, it took me about 10 years to finish graduate school, so I don't know from that.
She's really a smart girl.
Let's see, other questions?
No more questions?
Yes, sorry. You're right by the light,
I
it's
know, I
hard to
can't
see. So the comment was, she was really impressed by how those on stage today can share such personal and private relationship, and that it's so clear from the work that Francesca was such a passionate person, and that comes through despite the quality of the prints, that transcends.
I didn't mean to suggest that her prints were lousy, by the way, at
She
all.
would admit it.
It was just sort of like, it was just one of those subjective bars that we put ourselves through as students. But I would say that I am terribly grateful for this day and for this opportunity, because not unlike George, I have been sitting alone with my memory of Francesca in a box, wondering, what could have happened, and as her friend, who I think I've expressed a number of times already today, I sort of found myself worrying about her under different circumstances. It was what one did as her friend, was you found yourself worried. And now to have this opportunity to kind of discuss this with people that I haven't seen for 40 years, but that share kind of a common, love of that person, and to not feel as though one is exploiting that relationship. It's a very, very tricky line to walk.
Well, that was,
Oh, we
thanks
didn't-
for that. I mean, one of the things
to
that
talk about
is tricky when you go into a body of work where someone's become famous, that you aren't, oh, I'm going to go for the ride, or the work's become valuable, I don't want to cash in, or lots of things that you think about. You really take it down to, okay, what are my feelings around this? Am I ready to share this? What does that mean? Part of sharing it is letting go of both the work that you've been close to and all your the process of mourning and everything else. And in my case, part of it was letting go of control. Like, when I kept that box closed, I controlled everything. Like, it was my little thing. And to open it up, I mean, there were so many times that I remember leaving the Woodman loft in New York after one of my visits with Betty and getting Betty's blessing, but still calling my wife in tears saying, I can't do this. I can't let go of my control of this. And she said, you either have to trust Nora or you don't. And if you trust her, this is the process. And if you don't, just hold on to your box and, keep it. And that's, I think, the same with all of our feelings, that you get in a place after a while where we're ready to talk about it and we're ready to share it. And you need people that are sympathetic and empathetic and generous and ultimately really loving to help you through this. But I also want to say, we were talking about this relationship with Francesca and memories that we have. And I think all of us have, maybe not Francesca's in our life, although I would hope that many of you do, but memories that we hold on to and keep hidden in a box for a long time. And there's something incredibly powerful about being able to share things that you think are so private that you can't share with other people. And that's how you learn, and that's how you are generous, and that's how people are allowed to be closer to you. And I think that, at the same time this was going on, my mother passes away, and my grandparents passed away so young, and I never knew them. And I go down in the basement, and there's my mother's box. And in that box are these films. And you open them up, and they just stink like vinegar, and you think, oh, these are completely decomposed. And I took them to a place in Denver, and they sent me a little thumb drive. And I put the thumb drive in the computer, and there is my mother at 5 years old kissing her parents, and them holding her, and them walking, and I see them moving for the first time. And she could never, while she was alive, share that with me. And I just think that while we're here and while we're together, like, all that we can share with each other is really a gift that we give each other.